Colossians chapter 1 is where we're going to be. Let me remind you quickly, if you are a guest with us, go ahead and be turning to Colossians chapter 1. We're going to pick it up in verse 15. If you're a guest, if you're a visitor with us, thank you so much for being here. March 24th is a date that I want you to be aware of. March 24th, that's a Sunday. We're going to have our first Connections class of the year. And that's a time when you can come and learn about our church. We'll have a time of Q&A. You get to meet the staff people, and we'll explain everything that we're about as a church so that you can get a good idea of what you're thinking about maybe joining. So that's March 24th, directly following the morning service, outside our fellowship hall. So you'll leave this building and go down towards the gym area. Just, if you don't know where it is, just come find me and I'll take you down there. That's March 24th. You need to sign up by March 17th. That's a Sunday. Sign-ups, once again, it's find Pastor Chris or Pastor Jordan and say, hey, I want to come to that, and we'll write your name down. Now, there's a meal provided because we're Baptists, all right? And there's also child care. So if you have kids, bring them. All right, my kids will be in child care. Your kids can come to child care. It'll be a good time. So that's March 24th, Connections class, okay? All right, Colossians chapter 1. We started in the book of Colossians last week. We're going to be continuing in it for a while. The main point that I want you to hear today, the main point from the sermon is this, if you're taking notes. Jesus is God. That's it. Okay? Jesus is God. That's the main point. We're going to unpack that thing as we go this morning. Jesus is God. Now, let me catch us up from last week, just a brief overview from last week. Paul is writing to the church at Colossae. He's in prison, and he and Timothy, his spiritual son in the faith, are writing to the Colossians to encourage them. There's all sorts of different little reasons he wrote them. He packs a lot of good truth into this book. But the primary one is that there is a faction that has arisen within the congregation there that's telling the rest of the congregation that you need more than Jesus to be spiritual, to be holy. You need more than Jesus. And Paul's going to put an end to that once and for all. He writes a letter that winds up in the Bible to explain to these people, Jesus is all you need. He's all you need. He's the only person you need. He's the only program you need. That's all you need is Jesus. If you need more than Jesus, if the way that you have set your church up to run, if you need more than Him to operate, you're doing it wrong. Jesus is all that you need. And Paul is going to drive home that point all throughout the book of Colossians, but he is really going to hit his stride early here in chapter 1 in verses 15 through 20. And what it winds up being is one of the most Christologically rich passages of the entire Bible. Right? When we say Christologically, we mean Christ, about Christ, Christ-centered. Right? The doctrine of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. This is one of the most Christologically rich passages in the entire Bible. A strong argument could be made that it is the richest passage about Jesus in all of the Bible. And our task this morning is to unpack it in 40 minutes or so. So we've got a big task ahead of us. Jesus is God. That's our point. Jesus is God. Look at verse 15. We will start there. Colossians 1:15. He's talking about Jesus here. He says, He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Let's just go all the way through 20 to begin. Verse 16, for everything was created by Him, in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through Him and for Him. He is before all things, and by Him all things hold together. He is also the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that He might come to have first place in everything. For God was pleased to have all His fullness dwell in Him, and through Him to reconcile everything to Himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through His blood shed on the cross. Wow. Now we go back and we're going to unpack it verse by verse. Verse 15, He is the image of the invisible God. He is the image of the invisible God. All eyes up here. Jesus Christ is the image of the invisible God. We learn two things from this short part of this verse. Number one, God is invisible. Number two, Jesus is His image. God is invisible. Number two, Jesus is the image of God. So if you show my kids a picture of me, on a phone or a computer, or if you even have some old pictures of me or whatever, you show them a picture, and then who are they going to say that is? That's Daddy. That's their daddy, right? Because that's an image of me. If you want to know who God is, then you look to whom? Jesus. He is the image of the invisible God. So God is invisible. You don't see God and live. And so God, in the words of John Calvin, God accommodated himself to us through his son Jesus. God didn't have to do that. God didn't have to create you and get to know you personally. He doesn't owe you anything. Hopefully no one is here under the impression that God owes them anything. God doesn't owe us anything, which makes the fact that he sent his son to die for us all the more incredible. But God is invisible. But if you want to know him, well, he's got an image. Who is it? It's Jesus. Now, when I was in seminary, my seminary education was worth every penny that I paid for it. But I would have paid all of the money that I paid for that seminary education just for a few moments that stood out to me. And one of those moments, in a theology class, we were talking about the doctrine of Christ, and my professor started walking us through John chapter 14, where Philip, one of the disciples, says to Jesus, "Hey, Jesus, show us the Father," he says. "Show us the Father." And Jesus says to Philip, he says, "Philip, have I been with you so long? Have I been with you so long that you don't understand yet?" And then he says this, "If you have seen me, you have seen the Father." And I don't know if you know this, you've probably experienced this as a believer, but you know certain doctrines, that Jesus is God, right? I didn't blow anybody's mind this morning. If you go to church here, you're a Christian, whatever, you're like, yeah, okay. I didn't blow anybody's mind, but sometimes you hear things in a fresh way or maybe just a different way where it just clicks for you. Well, something clicked for me that day sitting at seminary. Because it had never dawned on me, that passage. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father, Jesus says. And so we focus a lot that Jesus was man, right? But I think a lot of times we lose this idea and really think about it, that Jesus was and is God. If you have seen me, you've seen the Father. So if you meet Jesus, if you go looking for God and you meet Jesus, you don't leave an encounter with Jesus saying, "All right, that was cool, but we still got to find God." No. Once you leave your encounter with Jesus, you're like, "Well, there it is. I found him." If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. He is the image of the invisible God. So if you don't know anything about God, maybe you're new here, it's first time in church, or maybe you came, it's first time in a long time, we're so glad you're here, and you don't know much about God. If you want to learn about God, then go read about Jesus in the Gospels, the first 4 books of your New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you start reading about Jesus' life here on earth, and know that as you're reading that, you're reading about God's life here on earth. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. He is the image of the invisible God. So this is why it won't do. This is why it won't do to say, I like the Jesus of the New Testament, but the God of the Old Testament, it's just kind of hard for me. Because it's the same guy. Now, to be sure, God does not operate always in the same ways. Is everyone following me? He doesn't operate in the same ways all the time. He changes the way he operates, but he never changes. Now, if you don't like the idea that God, changes how he operates, you can write me an angry email and I'll delete it, okay? But if God still was operating the same way as in Bible times, you'd be blood-soaked from all the sacrifices for your sin that they had to commit or that they had to offer for their sins, right? God changes the way he does things, but he never changes. You see, the God of the Old Testament is extremely gracious. Because that's the knock a lot of times. Well, I like Jesus. He's very gracious and merciful and all this kind of stuff. But the God of the Old Testament, I don't really like that. There's a lot of grace to be found in the Old Testament. Like when he told Adam and Eve, on the day that you eat of that fruit, you will surely die. Did they die that day? Mm-mm. They lived a long, long time. And when they sinned, they saw, and we're going to talk a lot about this next week, they saw for the first time that they were naked and they were ashamed, and they were really bad fashion designers, and they made themselves clothes out of fig leaves, and God said, that's not going to do. So he killed an animal and made them clothes. That's the first sacrifice for sins, that animal was, in Genesis 3. Because Hebrews 9:22 says that there is no forgiveness of sins without the shedding of blood. So there's so much grace for Adam and Eve. And then the story of Noah, I don't know why we quite tell this story to children, because it's a really violent story where God drowns the whole earth. Okay? You say, well, I don't know about that. Listen, God could have drowned the entire earth, but he saved 8 people because of his grace. And he destroyed all of Sodom and Gomorrah. But he was going to destroy him, and Abraham met with him. He was like, yeah, but God, what if you found 50 righteous people there? What if you found 50 righteous people? God says, okay, if I find 50 righteous people, I won't nuke the place. That's a paraphrase, by the way. You're like, that's not in the KJV. He says, okay, if I find 50, I won't do it. The neighbor says, whoa, what if you find 45? God says, okay, I won't do it. I won't nuke the place if I find 45. Well, what about 40? All right. Well, what about 30, God? If you just found 30 righteous people in all the cities, these 2 cities, okay, 30. What about 20? All right, 20. All right, what about 10? God says, okay, if I find 10, I'll let them live. And you know the story. God nuked Sodom and Gomorrah because he couldn't find 10 people. But if he had found 10 people, he would have let them live. The God of the Old Testament has much grace. But we don't have time to go through all of that. The Jesus of the New Testament, right? The Son of God comes and he incarnates himself. He comes to live among us, Jesus in the flesh. He comes to live among us. And the popular cultural idea of Jesus nowadays is that he's kind of this fairy guy who's just sprinkling fairy dust on everyone. And Jesus just wants everybody to hang out and love each other. Isn't this the idea that liberal Christianity would have us believe? Here's the thing. You don't murder nice guys. They murdered him. They didn't murder him because he was singing Kumbaya at the campfire wanting everyone to hang out. Those kind of guys don't get murdered on a cross. He was murdered because he says, I am Lord, not Caesar. I'm Lord. He was murdered because he called the Pharisees, who incited the riot to get him killed, he called them children of Satan. And then I don't know if you've ever heard the story of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5.